Sezam by Stanislaw Lem. Originally published in the author's Polish-language collection of stories entitled Sesame and Other Stories in 1954, and republished the following year, with the new title becoming simply Sezam. About half of the stories from the original printing were translated to English for his 1976 collection, The Star Diaries, which did not include the present story. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Sezam. My guide turned into a side corridor and stopped before a door so white it looked as if it had just been freshly lacquered. He pressed the handle and, with a gesture of his hand, invited me inside. This is it. The hall was filled with a matte, diffused light. Not far from the door stood a massive console of silvery metal with calm, refined lines curving like a horseshoe around a wooden chair. The surface of the console slanted toward it. Switches were thereupon arranged in a checkerboard pattern, a row of small clocks, and in the center, the narrow, black mouthpiece of a microphone on a jointed stand. Nothing else. I raised my head and froze. I had imagined the country's largest electronic brain as a gigantic scaffolding filled with a tangle of cables and devices. Instead, I stood before an enchanted wall of pale, veined marble from which thousands of tiny lights flickered constantly, glowing and fading, replaced by new ones. In their appearing and vanishing, there was something carefree, almost mischievous, as if a gigantic toy had been set in motion. The professor approached the console and asked me to come closer. His voice, when he spoke, sounded muffled, or rather submerged in a ceaseless, elusive murmur or hum, which carried something of the distant, monotonous voice of the ocean. At first I did not know where to look for its source. In the next moment, I realized it was the sound of electrical thinking, that dry, barely audible, yet all-encompassing rustle, as if hundreds upon hundreds of invisible, withered leaves were falling from the ceiling to the floor, was the combined voice of millions of flowing currents. Understanding this, I paused, and somewhere deep in my imagination there shimmered an incomprehensible, only conjectured image of that gigantic labyrinth, a billion-fold cloud of pulsating discharges, carrying within their branches and divisions some intricate, difficult content, transformed with dizzying speed on the way to its final solution. This image was fleeting and impossible to grasp, like the attempt to imagine infinity when gazing at a star-studded sky, when the mind, at a certain moment, falters and retreats in the awareness of an opening, engulfing abyss. The professor, however, was eager to begin his explanations, so I obediently stepped toward him. Although it was not what most interested me at the moment, I asked why there was no one at the console, clearly the control console of the electronic brain. "Because it is unnecessary," he replied. "The machine has been given a task and is solving it. It will take another hour. The problem is rather difficult." I asked what the task was. The professor tried to explain, but I understood little of his words. It had to do with issues related to new methods of transmitting electrical energy over great distances. "Do you know what the machine's name means?" asked the professor. "Sezam is the stationary electronic assembly of mathematical automata." As he spoke, then and later, I caught him frequently glancing toward the flickering lights. After some time, when I had grown somewhat accustomed to the situation, I noticed that he was not looking randomly, but that his gaze followed the tiers of restless sparks in a certain sequence. This did not disturb the flow of our conversation, but it filled me with an ever stronger sense that someone else was present, This person was to me completely incomprehensible and, in truth, almost invisible, while the professor seemed instantly to grasp the mysterious signals it sent him. More than once I saw him hesitate while answering my question, or, having finished a sentence, pause longer than necessary for breath. His eyes fixed somewhere deep in the hall as if the other had signaled something new with a blink, which the professor smoothly absorbed before turning his full attention back to me. Our Sezam is not just an ordinary electron vacuum machine, the professor continued. It can do incomparably more than the old American ENIACs. The principle of operation is in some measure similar, since for all our electronic brains we adopted it in the broadest simplification from the central nervous system of animals. But it is not merely an electrical abacus. With Sezam, one can communicate not only in the language of numbers, graphs, and equations, but also in words. One can ask it questions to which it replies. How does that happen? I asked, rather mechanically, for part of my attention was still drawn away by the flickering lights, which no longer seemed chaotic to me. Now I began to discern in them a mysterious meaning, hidden from me. The professor smiled faintly, as if my question had been expected. It happens through language, he explained. Sezam has been equipped with a system of symbolic interpretation. It can recognize words, assign them meaning, and respond accordingly. Of course, its vocabulary is limited, but sufficient for scientific dialogue. I listened, still unsettled by the flickering lights. They seemed to pulse in patterns, as though they were not random signals, but fragments of a hidden conversation. You must understand, the professor went on, that Sezam is not conscious in the human sense. It does not think as we do, but it processes information in ways that resemble thought. It can analyze, compare, and draw conclusions. That is why we sometimes speak of it as if it were alive. He paused again, his eyes fixed on the restless wall. I sensed that he was receiving silent cues, invisible to me from the machine itself. For a moment, I felt excluded, as though two beings were conversing in a language I could not comprehend. The task it is working on now, the professor added, concerns the transmission of electrical energy across vast distances. It is a complex problem, requiring immense calculations. Sezam is solving it step by step, faster than any human mind could hope to achieve. I nodded, though my thoughts were elsewhere. The shimmering lights seemed to beckon me, whispering of meanings beyond my grasp. I felt as though I were standing before a vast intelligence, playful yet unfathomable, a presence that was both mechanical and strangely alive. The principle is quite simple. It is best illustrated by an example. Let us say we wish to build a rocket capable of reaching the moon. First, we must provide the machine with all the necessary information, which is, of course, an ocean of data. At the beginning, we supply general facts. Here arises the issue of Earth's gravity, which the rocket must overcome. The problem of its aerodynamics in piercing the Earth's atmosphere, the problem of flight in a vacuum, the problem of landing on the moon, then the return launch, again taking into account the complex specifics of the conditions prevailing on the surface of our satellite. These are, so to speak, the framework of action. Next comes the turn of matters, in the broad sense of the word, engineering. These are therefore facts about raw materials, about technological processes of treatment, about rocket engines, about various types of jet propulsion, and so forth. Once we have conveyed all this to Sezam, one might say we have taught it astronautics, aerodynamics, a full course in the strength of materials, thermodynamics, and so on. When this knowledge is already stored in the reservoirs of its electronic memory, we then provide additional conditions, the so-called constraints. For example, that the rocket should not exceed certain dimensions, that the engine power should not be greater than a specified value, or that the flight time must not be longer than a given number of hours. Sometimes we do not know whether, under such assumptions, the construction is even possible. But that is a small matter, for Sezam, after thinking it over for a time, will give us an exact answer. All this work could, in principle, be carried out not by an electronic brain, but by a large, well-coordinated team of designers, energy specialists, engineers, and meteorologists. Then, when all the calculations and plans were ready, one would have to proceed to the construction of an actual rocket and the first test flights. Yet we know that the first design is never perfect, and that in the course of experiments there arises the necessity of introducing numerous changes and corrections. If all this work were done by people, it would lead to lengthy, tedious, extremely costly, and often dangerous trials and experiments. Sezam spares us all of this, for when it has developed the design of the rocket, we can proceed to tests of launches and flights, as well as to the study of all kinds of disturbances in travel, without a real rocket, but only by conducting experiments on the rocket conceived by Sezam. This happens in such a way that different parts of Sezam's circuits take on the role of the Earth, the Moon, the atmosphere, and the conditions prevailing in it, such as winds, temperatures, and so forth. An enormous number of factors enter into play, and in this environment, our lunar rocket performs various flights and maneuvers. I hope you will not take this too literally. Naturally, there is no Earth or winds inside Sezam. There are simply groups of certain formulas, numbers constantly changing in a strictly interdependent manner. But that is all we need. We obtain answers to questions, such as how the rocket will behave if some part of the gyroscopic compasses is damaged, what the chance of collision with a meteor is, what the temperature of the shell will be when piercing the atmosphere. The number of such problems is legion. Well, yes, I said, but could not these imagined experiments also be carried out on paper by calculators? Theoretically, they could, replied the professor with a smile, but each would take weeks, if not months. In effect, dozens of excellent specialists would work for 6 or 7 years. Meanwhile, various data, for example, concerning the rocket engine, would become outdated because new, better engines would appear. Thus, this team of people would sit for years, calculating, measuring, sketching, introducing ever new corrections. It is an obvious nonsense. Sezam, on the other hand, conducts all the trials within a dozen or so hours. I have heard that there is a whole queue of tasks awaiting solution. Ah, yes, indeed. That is a temporary situation caused by the fact that we have only one such electronic brain so far. It is therefore still our bottleneck. Various ministries, institutions, and scientific centers turn to us. Sezam solves several hundred problems each month, ranging from the most economical planning of new industrial plants to the fate of a cloud of neutrons deep within an atomic pile. The needs of our science and our construction are immense in this regard. In the near future, we will begin building new electronic brains, and, amusing as it may sound, Sezam itself will play a significant role in designing them. Thus they will, in a sense, be its children, perhaps more than once superior to their parent. The professor now led me to the other side of the console, where, as it turned out, on its vertical surface there was a simplified diagram of Sezam's connections. It was a system of neon tubes joined together, trembling and glowing with short, miniature flashes of lightning. The professor began to explain it to me, but I could not follow the course of his exposition, for in my consciousness there arose an irritating sensation that someone was standing behind me, staring at me with a persistent gaze. I shifted from foot to foot and moved my shoulders slightly. The professor broke off his lecture and asked with a faint smile, "The feeling of someone else's gaze, is it not?" "Yes," I admitted, embarrassed by his perceptiveness. "It is nothing," he said. "It happens to everyone at first. Some time must pass before one becomes accustomed to it. There is nothing mystical in it. It is simply the unceasing awareness that someone is thinking and watching behind our backs. And since throughout our lives we have grown used to the belief that only a living being can think and watch, hence this peculiar illusion." "Professor," I said, "Sezam is truly an extraordinary creation, and yet I must admit that besides admiration, it awakens in me a certain feeling of aversion to this mechanical brain, an aversion whose source I cannot at this moment define. Perhaps it arises from the fact that this machine surpasses me in intellectual capability, and that is something entirely different from the superiority which, let us say, an electric motor has over my muscles." "Ah, so you take the position that it," here the professor gestured behind him, "is more perfect than our mind." He reflected for a moment. "This question, you see, of superiority or inferiority has little sense at all. Is an encyclopedia superior to us? I assure you it is just as lifeless as Sezam." "An encyclopedia does not think," I observed. "Sezam does not think either in the literal sense," the professor replied at once. "Popularizers have done some harm by emphasizing the supposedly extraordinary resemblance of electronic brains to the human mind. In fact, the comparison of Sezam to a living brain is very strained. But if you wish, we may attempt it. After all, one can compare anything with anything. Schematically, when we consider the very fabric of construction, the matter stands thus. The living brain consists of elementary units, which are nerve cells, neurons. The counterpart of a neuron in Sezam is the cathode tube. Our Sezam is very large and contains over 10,000 tubes, but the brain has tens of thousands of millions of neurons, that is, 10 billion. Meanwhile, our brain fits perfectly within the head, and in working consumes fractions of a watt of energy, whereas Sezam occupies 2 floors, weighs 170 tons, and consumes 160,000 watts. Why? The answer is simple. The volume of the smallest cathode tube is about 1 billion times greater than the volume of a neuron. It also consumes about 1 billion times more energy, yet in responding to stimuli it is faster, for a neuron reacts within 1/20th of a second, while a tube in about 1/200,000th of a second. Now let us make the balance. For a tube, we expend 1 billion times more, and in return it works 1,000 times faster than a living cell, which means that its efficiency is 1,000,000 times less than that of a neuron. If we wished to build an electronic brain containing as many tubes as the brain has neurons, it would prove technically completely unfeasible. Not only the human brain, but even the nervous system of a mere worm contains more elements than our mighty Sezam. The question arises whether the electronic brain could be improved by further reducing the size of its tubes. It turns out that as long as we continue to use today's construction principles, no. The controlling space, which decides the fate and path of the impulse, is in the tube, the distance between the cathode and the grid. It measures about 1 millimeter. In a neuron, this space corresponds to the cell membrane, whose thickness is about 1/1000th of a millimeter. That is the entire difference, and the reason why the human brain weighs 1.5 kilograms, while Sezam weighs 170 tons. That is the whole difference. For the electrical voltage, in proportion to the size of the controlling space, is very similar here and there. The difference is 1/1000th in one dimension. To obtain volume, we must multiply 1,000 by 1,000 by 1,000. And again, we have the billion that appeared in our calculation a moment ago. Why, then, can we not reduce the size of the controlling space? Here we reach the critical point of our considerations. To the layman, it seems that the material from which the electronic brain is made, like any machine, is better than the material from which our body is formed, since living organisms consist of delicate, soft jelly, while in machines we have solid, hard metals. In reality, the matter is quite the opposite. Once again, since we have come to speak of it, let us compare the neuron and the cathode tube. In the tube, we have metals, cathode and grid, separated only by a vacuum, since a combination is characterized by instability and unreliability of operation, unknown to the living organism. For example, if a short circuit occurs, the entire tube is ruined. And speaking more generally, a metal construction, if damaged, shows not the slightest tendency to repair itself spontaneously. Whereas if we damage the membrane of a neuron, which, I remind you, functionally corresponds to the space between grid and cathode, then after a few hours no trace of the damage remains. It heals. Show me a cathode tube that heals itself. How so? I interjected. Does not the machine compensate for this lack with its speed, its efficiency? I knew you would resist, cried the professor, his eyes flashing. He no longer resembled the phlegmatic elderly gentleman, tapping the case of his glasses against the console as if he wished to break it into pieces. He shouted, "That lack, my dear sir, nothing can compensate. The problem of self-repair is not some oddity of thought, an engineer's whim, but a stubbornly hard nut to crack, appearing whenever technology enters a new, higher stage of development. At present, we still manage somehow, but I assure you that in the coming decades the keenest minds will launch an attack in this direction. For it is thus, in a machine consisting of a relatively small number of parts, a defect is nothing terrible, but when, as in Sezam, thousands of elements are involved, the designer must go to extreme lengths to prevent the danger that arises each time a relay fails or a tube burns out. Otherwise, the machine will begin to give us false results. What then? The name of this brain is not accidental. It is called the assembly of mathematical automata because it is indeed an assembly composed of 3 apparatuses, identical to each other, working in parallel and independently on each assigned problem. Thanks to this, we always obtain 3 results. If they are identical, all is well. If they differ, it means that an error has been committed in the course of work, and we set out to search for the defect. Such an expensive, complicated system is dictated to us by necessity. Meanwhile, living organisms, representing a degree of complexity incomparably higher, manage perfectly without such waste.
The ability of self-repair, desirable but not strictly necessary in a simple machine, is for living organisms a property without which their existence would be impossible. If in the future self-repairing machines arise, it will be a revolution, compared with which the invention of the steam engine was a trifle. Nevertheless, I assure you that it will be done, if it must. How? It is hard to say. Give us some time. Nature created living organisms in the course of 2 billion years of evolution. That was enough for thorough planning and construction trials. We have been building electronic brains for barely a dozen years. Come back to us in the future. Not necessarily in 2 billion years, perhaps in 2,000, and by then we shall have managed to improve more than a little.
I must admit, I said, that you have astonished me, but I am already beginning to shake off this paean to living tissues. You have convinced me that the living brain is 1,000,000 times more economical and efficient than the mechanical one, but after all, this machine surpasses it in speed, and if we disregard size and energy expenditure, which we can perhaps afford, then in Sezam we have a device that can not only assist us in intellectual work, but perform that work, even creative work, in our stead. The professor looked at me with a frown.
Even creative work, you say? And in what way, if I may ask?
But you yourself have shown the way. If one gives Sezam the data concerning a certain problem and demands an answer to a question.
To what question?
The professor asked quickly. I felt uneasy, for an invisible wave overwhelmed me with the atmosphere of a distant past. The final examination, stern faces of professors, the examiner's tricky questions. I hesitated. Well, that depends on what interests us.
Of course, but moving among such vague generalities, we shall not succeed in clarifying the issue you have raised, namely whether the electronic brain can not only assist man, but also replace him in creative work. I will tell you, he continued after a moment, a certain story as peculiar as it is instructive, the story of the failure of a young man who thought exactly as you do, that Sezam is not a helper but a substitute for man in the struggle with unsolved problems. You must know that various specialists come here to us, young scholars, aspirants, engineers, for several months of training in the operation of Sezam. For every profession, every branch of science must have a liaison between its problems and the collective of our institute, so that we can quickly decide whether a given task falls within Sezam's production profile or not. Well, half a year ago, a certain biologist appeared among us, very young and therefore extremely categorical in his assertions, who, having become acquainted with Sezam, was inflamed both with enthusiasm for its possibilities and with contempt for the local staff, whom he called routine-bound. I was one of them, the professor added. You solve narrow, shallow problems that could be solved even without the electronic brain, this young man said to me, whereas Sezam allows one to leap over whole decades, indeed perhaps centuries of scientific development. I asked him how he imagined that. Quite simple, he replied. One must ask Sezam questions to which we do not know the answers and cannot even guess them, not in some narrow technological matters. He considered, for example, the lunar rocket problem to be such, but aiming at the greatest depths of the unknown. You must understand that such a young man not only has the right but also the duty to formulate a problem independently and present it to Sezam for solution. It is, as it were, a small diploma examination in which he demonstrates that he can, without the help of our specialists, make use of the full range of possibilities of the complex apparatus. "The question I shall put to Sezam," said the young man to me, "will be how to cure cancer." Well, to this I replied, "From the electronic brain one cannot extract more information than we have put into it. Paradoxical as it may seem, when we ask Sezam a question, we give it so much information that the answer is already contained within it, only hidden from us in the thicket of informational material, and it merely extracts it with immense speed and presents it in clear and simple form. Naturally, this happens quite differently than, for example, in a machine that extracts pure metal from ore. But the principle is the same. Sezam possesses only such knowledge as we have previously placed within it. And that is all. The entire power of the electronic brain is of no use if we ask it questions in the wrong way, or, which amounts to the same, if we supply it with false information. When I mentioned earlier, for example, the lunar rocket, the information we gave Sezam already contained the answer, for we had filled it with knowledge of astronautics, thermodynamics, and so forth. If, instead of real facts about the moon, we had declared to it that the moon is a ball of green cheese floating 10 kilometers above the earth, Sezam would naturally not be surprised or protest, for it is incapable of that, but would accept it, so to speak, at face value, and after working diligently would give us a scrupulous plan of a rocket, utterly useless in the real world. Thus, to a question combined with false information comes a false answer. If instead of false facts we gave it a mistaken theory, the result would be just as disastrous. Sezam bases its work on the supplied material of facts and theories, but both come from outside. That is, people must first gather the facts, then creatively generalize them into theoretical abstraction, and pass onto it the whole burden. When we ask about a lunar rocket, we are confident of the answer because there is only one theory of jet propulsion and astrogation. But there are many theories of the origin of cancer, and they are contradictory. On which, then, should it rely in formulating the question? To this he answered, "Oh, I shall be cautious. I will give Sezam all known facts concerning the chemistry of cells, metabolism, all descriptions of possible courses of cancerous disease, data on environmental influence, statistics concerning age, other illnesses, diet, heredity, and so forth, and it will itself work out these data and tell us what cancer is and how to cure it." "No," I replied, "it will not do that." "Why not?" "For the same reason that the following experiment would fail. Let us say we wish to give someone a method of distinguishing any radio set from every other thing in the world that is not such a set. This can be done in two ways. First, if we know the theoretical foundations of radio engineering, we fill a few pages with diagrams of electrical connections, teach him a few formulas, and say to him, 'Here is a notebook with plans. If you find some object and do not know whether it is a radio or not, examine whether it has connections corresponding to one of the combinations in the notebook. If you find that it does, it will be a radio. Otherwise, it will be something else.' But there is also a second way. If we know nothing of the foundations of radio engineering and nothing of induction, feedback, and the whole theory of Maxwell's electromagnetic waves, then we cannot, even on an ox hide, write down all the features by which our man is to distinguish a radio from a non-radio. We shall tell him, therefore, that it is usually a box, but not always, for there may be a radio without a box, that from it comes the human voice and music, but that may also be a gramophone or jukebox, that there is an illuminated scale with inscriptions, but not always, that there is an antenna. But radar devices also have antennas, and so on and so forth. We shall describe all possible kinds of speaker coverings, kinds of polish, colors of ebonite knobs, shapes of tubes. It will take an enormous amount of space, and what will be the result? That recognition of a radio on the basis of these features will not be certain at all, for most of them are completely irrelevant and unimportant to the functioning of the radio. Our man will go searching and at once, in the first case, be deceived because some joker has built a radio thus: 2 tubes set in the cellar, a coil and a variometer on the first floor, capacitors in the attic, all connected with wires, the antenna made from an old iron bed, power drawn from a thermocouple above a kerosene lamp, and our investigator will be duped. The whole description, occupying 20 or 100 volumes, will prove worthless. Why is this so? Because, in the first case, we give the constructive idea, the principle of operation, in short, the general theory, which in a few formulas and diagrams embraces all possibilities of building radio receivers. And this theory, most importantly, is not at all similar to the external appearance of the average radio. In the second case, however, we enumerate thousands of features occurring in this or that apparatus, but we shall never be certain whether they are necessarily and inseparably connected with the functioning of the radio, or whether they are some accidental, trivial adornments. And now, let us look at the problem of cancer. In the present state of science, it is rather a phenomenon of the second type than of the first. One describes external features, the appearance of cells and so forth, but there is no unified theory that would generalize all this and tell us what is important here and what is accidental and trivial. If I supply more and more facts, then in the end Sezam will be able to create a general theory. The stubborn young man replied, "Never in the world," I answered. "Let us say that all known radios have at the back of the box a perforated board. Naturally, this board will be found at the very beginning of our list. For we shall say, since it is in every radio set, then ho, ho! It must be some extraordinarily important feature. The result, however, will be lamentable. Sezam, which, as is known, is surprised at nothing and considers nothing impossible, urged on by us, will obediently strive to produce a theory in which that unfortunate board occupies a prominent place. I wonder what would come of that, even if you gave it 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000 further descriptive features. It would not help. Sezam would choke on that idiotic board, which it could in no way force into a theory, and in addition it would know nothing at all of the most important thing, the existence of the transmitting station, without which the radio cannot play at all. There is therefore no doubt that even after 1,000 years it would not stumble upon Maxwell's theory, for how could it? It would manipulate abstractions of boards, generalizations of boxes, wallow in thousands of descriptions, and produce the greatest nonsense imaginable. A similar story applies to cancer. You may feed Sezam information about people suffering from cancer, their height, what they eat, how they sleep, how their hair grows, and perhaps all of this is utterly irrelevant. Perhaps cancer is caused by factor X, unknown to science until now, just as in our example, Maxwell's theory was once unknown. All these arguments only made the young man more obstinate. No doubt he imagined himself a Galileo forced by the Inquisition to recant his science, and I am certain he repeated inwardly, "E pur si muove," and yet it moves. "The problem is more difficult than I thought," he said, "but I shall try to overcome it." And so, when the time came for his diploma work, he began supplying Sezam with information. He carried and carted it in by the volume, day and night. There were autopsy reports, morphological descriptions, theories of cancer formation, viral and biochemical, data from histology, embryology, and pathological anatomy. I shall not enumerate everything, for it would take too long. Suffice it to say that within a week, Sezam absorbed more knowledge about cancer than a man could accumulate in a lifetime devoted solely to studying professional literature. At last, convinced it was enough, the young man launched his decisive attack and asked Sezam the question, how to cure cancer. Here a completely new difficulty arose. Sezam did not answer at all, for, so to speak, it did not understand what was meant. The matter is thus. When we converse with one another, we utter many words that explain themselves. Every person, even if not a scholar or physician, more or less understands what "to cure a disease" means, but the electronic brain cannot guess. For it, nothing is self-evident. It had to be explained precisely what "to cure" meant. The young man set about it thus. To cure, that is, to make it so that cancer is no longer in the organism. To make cancer no longer in the organism, Sezam replied, it must be removed. This was very simple, but did not advance the matter at all. How to remove cancer? My researcher asked further. Sezam answered immediately, it must be isolated from the organism. Naturally, the young man was very angry. He began to wrestle with Sezam, formulating questions ever differently. He did this hundreds of times. In various phases, Sezam, whose patience is unlimited precisely because it does not know what patience is, gave various answers. For example, when the young man reached more subtle formulations and asked, how to stop the spread of cancer in the organism without removing it, without cutting it out, and without using Röntgen rays, Sezam replied, the organism must be killed. Then the cancer will also die. He therefore had to introduce additional conditions, stating that in stopping this cancerous growth, one must not harm the organism. It then turned out that Sezam did not know what harm meant, for how could a system of cathode tubes know anything of that? This went on for quite some time. Sly questions and nonsensical answers abounded, until finally, one evening he burst into my room shaking a sheet of paper. He had an answer, not some grotesque one, but concrete, real. Sezam had given him the formula of a chemical compound which, introduced into the organism, would stop the spread of cancer without killing or destroying the organism. That is, without causing it any harm, the young man assured me. Although I did not believe in the effectiveness of the compound, I was genuinely curious what result its testing would yield, and how Sezam had understood the term not harm. The compound, we still have some residue of it in the laboratory, was an extraordinarily complex preparation. Some anthracene, phenanthrene derivative with pterin substituents and so forth. Sezam also specified how it should be synthesized. Several chemist colleagues set to work and soon produced a sufficient dose of the substance for experiments. He brought it here in triumph. It was an oily liquid with an aromatic smell. The young man took several dozen mice in which artificially induced liver cancer was already developing and injected each with a dose of the drug. Each mouse sat in a separate cage. There were about 50 in all. Half received the drug. The other half served as the usual control in the experiment, and he waited to see what would happen. 2 or 3 days later, he was summoned to Krakow on some professional matter. He left for 2 weeks. As soon as he returned, he rushed to the laboratory where the mice were kept. They were locked in a separate room. By chance, I was nearby and heard his cry, not of triumph, but of horror. All of us working at the instruments rushed into that room. I shall not soon forget what I saw. The cages with the mice stood on shelves. My young man had just taken one out and immediately dropped it so that it fell onto the table. Approaching, I saw what had so terrified him. The entire cage, a wire cuboid of dimensions 12 by 10 by 8 centimeters, was filled with a pulsating grayish mass that bulged through the mesh like swollen rubber. The most dreadful thing was that this cubic mass was alive. I saw clearly how it quivered, moved by the subcutaneous pulse of blood. It was covered with a kind of matted, half-horny hair, and in one place one could discern an improbably deformed and enlarged mouse's head, as if simultaneously split and flattened by pressure. When we reached for other cages, in all those where the mice had been treated with the medicine, we found the same sight. Each was completely filled with a swelling mass of living flesh. The very first autopsy explained everything. The professor stopped and looked me in the eye. Have you perhaps heard of the method used by the Indians on the prairies of the Wild West when they saw a fire advancing through the dry grasses of the steppe? They would set fire to part of the surrounding prairie. The artificially kindled blaze destroyed the grass, and the advancing fire found no food. Well, the medicine that Sezam created at the young man's command worked on precisely that principle. Like fought like. It created simply the most powerful carcinogenic preparation imaginable. Under its influence, the entire organism, with skin, muscles, and internal organs, became cancerous. All tissues began to proliferate with unrestrained vigor, aimlessly and chaotically. Yet these tissues did not succumb to the original cancer with which the mice had already been afflicted. Thus, at least formally, the young man's demand was fulfilled. As a remedy for cancer, Sezam used a cancer still more malignant. Indeed, in its own way, with absolute logic, it interpreted the words, to stop the growth of cancer without killing the organism. In the limiting conditions, nothing had been said that it could not be done by means of another cancer. The professor broke off, looking at me with shining eyes. After a long silence, amid the steady hum of currents, I spoke with some hesitation. Well, yes, Professor, but if the limiting conditions had been more strictly, more precisely defined, if one had asked Sezam the question, while better safeguarding against the possibility of absurdity, you yourself said it created a powerful carcinogen. Why, then, could it not create a more powerful cure? Et tu, Brute? Contra me?
With an energy one would hardly have suspected in him, the professor began to speak, gesticulating.
So there is a hidden Don Quixote in you as well. How is it, have I not explained that from the electronic brain one cannot extract more information than we have put into it? Sezam was filled with knowledge of the chemistry of tumors, and thus also with knowledge of the chemical structure of carcinogenic agents. Therefore, we ourselves supplied it with the data from which it later constructed its answer. Do you not see this? It was asked to stop the growth of cancer, and it achieved success, for the tissues treated with the medicine did not die. On the contrary, they continued to live, opposing the original cancer. And how? For within them a cancerous growth was raging. Well then, could we not obtain a good answer by asking Sezam new and further questions? If that answer were hidden in the informational material, it is not impossible, but any good answer would fall as the 10,000th or 10,000,000th in a shower of nonsensical replies. Wishing to test each experimentally, we scholars would turn into clowns. It would be a return to that noble method described by Swift in Gulliver's Travels, consisting in throwing printing types onto the floor. After several sextillions or centillions of throws, they would, by blind chance, arrange themselves into the proper sought-after answer. Such must be the effect when one attempts to replace man's creative activity with the work of the electronic brain.
For some time already, something had been changing in the flickering of the lights on Sezam's front wall. The pink and lilac side lamps had gone out, and in the center there appeared on the screen the outline of a greenish curve. When the professor finished, there was silence for several seconds, suddenly broken by a voice coming from nearby. But it was not the professor who spoke. A low voice, metallic in tone, issued from a loudspeaker hidden in the console. It pronounced loudly only one word: "Ready!" The professor noticed that I had started, and wishing, no doubt, to end our conversation in a striking manner, turned toward the lights, which seemed to gaze at us motionlessly, bowed slightly, and with a barely perceptible smile on his lips said, "Thank you, Sesam." You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.